I'm going to stand back and take my mask off so people can hear me. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the annual Athena Lecture. The Athena Lecture has been a highlight of our academic calendar since 2001, and we're delighted that we can once again welcome some people in person on campus and have an in-person presentation. Thank you for joining us. I'd also like to welcome all our attendees who've joined online. This meeting is also being broadcast. We have a hybrid event, and it's also going to be recorded, and it will be on our Imperial YouTube channel afterwards, so you can watch back as many times as you like. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We're not expecting a fire alarm, so if there is fire alarms go off, then please leave the building in a calm and orderly manner. The muster point is at the end of Exhibition Road and Imperial College Road, so that's the corner by the Dyson School. But hopefully we'll have an uninterrupted hour or so to really listen to our speaker. There will be question and answers at the end. If you're joining us online, you can use the Q&A function to enter any questions. You can do that as the lecture is ongoing, or you can wait to the end. In the room, please raise your hand in the old-fashioned way, and we have a roaming mic to come and speak to you. If you're online, you also have the option of posting your questions anonymously, should you wish to do so. I'm afraid in the room, we can't give you that option, but hopefully you'll be happy just to join in the conversation. Right, so on to the main event. I'm really delighted to invite our speaker, Magdalena Skipper, who is the 8th editor-in-chief for Nature. She's a geneticist by training, completed her undergraduate in Nottingham and then a PhD in Cambridge at the MRC in molecular biology. She's obviously a brilliant scientist, but also a brilliant communicator and has been working in publishing for some time. She's also, and I think this is really relevant for the focus of this talk, a passionate advocate for EDI. She leads the editorial champion for Nature Group, and she initiated the Inspiring Science Award for early career female researchers, and she's really keen on driving that widening participation agenda. It's always interesting to hear how people's careers have led them to a point, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Magdalena talks about her trajectory and pathway to get to this point, and she's got an interesting and intriguing title of Passions, Failures, Bold Decisions, and Alternative Careers. So without further ado, and with great thanks to Magdalena, I would like to welcome you here to give this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. And of course, thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure and a real honor to be part of this series. You've had some fantastic speakers in the series before. Your brief is very, very tough. I will try to rise to the challenge. But of course, I'm also extremely happy to be able to be here with you in person. I'm also glad that we are joined by some online. But it's so nice after a time of so many restrictions to be able to, at least in a smaller forum, meet together in person. So I chose this intriguing, thank you for saying that, title, and a rather complex one, because I do want to tell you about the passions that I developed really very early on in my life that have stayed with me throughout, and how many of those passions are actually reflected in what nature does. Not because I necessarily drove them, but there is an interesting convergence of principles and focus. I also want to talk about some failures. I think failure is really important in life and in general. And of course, scientists, researchers know all about failure, and it's something to embrace and learn from. Bold decisions, I made a couple of them, at least, in my life, and I'll mention them. And of course, I'll talk about alternative careers. My career is often referred to as an alternative career, which very often I myself find somewhat entertaining. There is very little that is alternative about what I do, after all. So let's start from the beginning. When I think about my childhood, there are a couple of really strong memories of defining themes in my childhood. And one of them, in fact, is a passion for learning and knowledge itself. It's something I remember my parents instilling in me from the very early days. And that in itself perhaps is not surprising. Many of you may have similar memories from your early days. What I think is really important that I want to share with you here, something that has affected me throughout my life, is the fact that I was encouraged both by my parents and educators in my early life to pursue knowledge and interests regardless of where they took me. And this is something that not so many women of my generation can say. Many of them have encountered being pushed or directed in a particular direction because of their gender. So I guess what I'm saying is that I don't have any memory of ever being pushed towards any particular interest or any particular pursuit because I was a girl. I was always encouraged to do whatever I wanted to do because I was a person that was interested in one thing or another. What's important for me in this context is that nature itself has had an interest in education for a long time, right, since its inception. And I'm sharing with you here one example from really early days back in 1874. And just as a reminder, Nature was first published in 1869. And in these early days, there was a lot of focus on education, and especially education of women in the pages of Nature. And this particular example is a sort of a little vignette, a letter to the editor, where the author of the letter is talking about education of women and specifically highlighting the fact that it's sort of unusual that boys and girls are being directed to learn specific topics. And here the issue is music. And very entertainingly, the author says, in England, particularly mentioned that whereas music is in England but rarely taught to boys, it is almost compulsory for girls, whether or not they have a talent for it. And of course, education in general, but especially of women, remains a really important issue for us today at Nature. You heard already a reference to a Nature Award scheme, which I helped co-launch about 4 years ago now. That's especially for early career researchers, women early career researchers. And there are two aspects to this award. One is for individuals who excel in research, and the other one is for organizations, initiatives, or institutions that support teaching of science and science-related topics to young women and girls in particular. So every year we have two categories in this prize, and I'll come back to this a little bit later. It's something which I feel very strongly about, and I think it's very important. So on to my first failure. My passion for learning and for science, well, for science actually also, incidentally, I think every child is really a budding scientist. If you think about how children ask questions, how they probe reality, it's really quite similar to what we do, those of us who go into research later. I was a very good student. I enjoyed learning enormously, but then I came across the first challenge. And very ironically, my first challenge was genetics. So at some point at school, I can't remember exactly how old I was, but I was quite young. As part of my biology lessons, we came to learn about the principles of inheritance. And it was the first time that for some reason, I found it challenging to work out these so-called Punnett squares. So the prediction of the genotypes in the offspring from a cross or a breeding experiment. And I guess my focus, wanting to overcome this challenge, led me towards spending more and more time on genetics, really working through the problems and learning the discipline and indeed principles of inheritance in much more detail, so much so that I developed a real passion and real love for genetics, and that never really left me. I continued with that very focus afterwards. Speaking of passions, I have a confession to make. As a child, I wasn't really a great reader. Many of my friends at the time loved to spend time with a book. For some reason, I just could not find books that I could get into for long enough. So I started many books, and most of them remained unfinished. There was, however, one book, and this is the book I'm showing you a picture of here. So I'm Polish, I grew up in Poland, and this was a book which was written specifically for sort of teenage audience. The book is about Newton, and the title of the book is The Road to Cambridge. It's a novel, as I say, written for a younger reader, but very much based on fact. I loved this book. I read it several times. In fact, I have this very copy. I took this picture just the other day at home. I still have it at home with me now. I really, really loved this book, became really excited about the prospect that that journey that Newton, as it was described in the book, that journey that Newton made, and indeed his life through his years in Cambridge. And I decided, you know, picture me, right, aged like probably 10 or 11, in Warsaw, I decided I was going to go to Cambridge. Now, you already know that I did, but I just remind you that correlation is no causation, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I did. That love of genetics that I developed through sort of overcoming that early failure at school stayed with me throughout high school, and then my first sort of bold decision, if you like, was that I moved from Poland to here, to the UK, and I went to University of Nottingham to study genetics. And I knew exactly that I wanted to do genetics as an undergraduate degree. So the universities I applied to were specifically universities that offered genetics as an undergraduate course, because that's what I loved, that's what I knew I wanted to do. I ended up in Nottingham, which has a fantastic genetics department. I really, you know, it was, I remember that time as a sort of heady time of reading, you know, Richard Dawkins and John Maynard Smith. I was particularly interested in molecular evolution and evolutionary genetics at the time. But one thing that I want to particularly highlight from that part of my life is mentorship, the importance of having encouraging mentors who listen to you as a mentee. And so I want to specifically call out my tutor from my undergraduate years, Professor John Brookfield, who was incredibly supportive and incredibly instrumental in really guiding me, you know, what I should study. As I say, I was really interested in evolutionary genetics. At that time, I didn't care so much about molecules, and I thought, oh, you know, I'm not really interested in all these transcription factors and other things like this. And I remember very clearly to this day him telling me, well, you know, you really need to study these other things because you need to understand how, at the macro level, these things really come about. And mentoring, we all know it's important, and yet we continue to underappreciate it. Mentoring, of course, is a two-way process. Increasingly, these days, we talk about something that sometimes people talk reverse mentoring. So I personally, for example, today, at this stage in my life, particularly appreciate mentorship from early career researchers or early career colleagues. I think I have a lot to learn from them also, and then it becomes a two-way process. And so in an attempt to recognize the importance of mentorship, we at Nature started another award, a Mentoring in Science award. This award was started by my predecessor as editor-in-chief of Nature, Phil Campbell, and I've continued it. Every year we focus on a different country, otherwise it will be quite difficult to compare. And this year, we haven't actually finalized the award, but this year we're focusing on Brazil in particular. As I say, I think mentorship should be much better recognized than it is today. And so, very excited as I was finishing my undergraduate studies in Nottingham, and I was trying to choose what I was going to do later. There was no question in my mind that what I was going to do was going to be research. The question, of course, was going to be where. And no, I did not already know that I was going to go to Cambridge because of that book that I showed you earlier. But I did end up in Cambridge, and the reason for it was that in my choice of where I was going to do my PhD, I was very much driven by the topic that I was going to investigate. One of the things that I have valued over anything else in research, but actually also in the work that I do today, is that intellectual stimulation of scientific process, the formulating questions, the answering of the questions, how as you begin to arrive at the answer, how your question can actually morph and indeed give rise to other questions. So it was that intellectual pursuit and satisfaction, if you like, that I was really seeking in my PhD. And I ended up in Cambridge in the LMB, in Laboratory of Molecular Biology, because the topic that at the time was being offered, and remember, I was always, again, continuing to be interested in genetics, the topic that was being offered, I just found so incredibly exciting. So I ended up doing a PhD on C. elegans, a little worm model organism for geneticists and developmental biologists. And this was in the lab of Dr. Jonathan Hodgkin. That lab had spent many years studying sex determination in C. elegans. And at the time when I arrived in the lab, the real focus was at the very beginning of that whole pathway that determines sex in the worms. And effectively, the question was, how does the zygote know that it's going to become, in the case of the worm, hermaphrodite or a male? And it was already known that it's likely to be a sort of a counting mechanism of a kind. So how do you translate in a biological system, how do you translate a quantitative signal to a qualitative one, of course, with all the tissues being affected by the different sex? I was fascinated by that question. And then the picture which you see in the bottom of the slide shows Leckhampton, which is the graduate part of Corpus Christi. That was the college I was part of in Cambridge. And the reason for showing this image is because somewhere in that building, I remember sitting thinking, the sex determination, for those of you who are not biologists or developmental biologists, sex determination is one of the fastest evolving traits in living organisms. And I thought, this is amazing. I can just imagine the whole research career unfolding before me. I'm going to do comparative evolutionary genomics, or genetics actually, I should say. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Comparative evolutionary genetics to understand how it is that sex determination as a system evolves in organisms. But one of the things that I think we don't really spend enough time talking about is how different life from being an undergraduate to being a postgraduate or a graduate student really is. There's really quite some transition. And I personally, it took me a while to make that transition. I was interested in the topic, there's no question about it. But if you think about it, the dynamic of knowledge acquisition, everything you do on a daily basis is so different. As an undergraduate, you sort of literally drinking from a fire hose of information that others have acquired and now sharing with you. Of course, the beauty of doing research yourself is that you're determining new knowledge for the first time. But of course, that takes time. And as we all know, most of the time, things don't work. And so it's for that change of pace of acquisition of knowledge and the need to deal with failure effectively on a daily basis is something that certainly when I made that transition, I guess I wasn't completely ready for. And my contemporaries were not very well prepared for. And I wonder if today we do a good enough job of it. And so in Nature, we have a career section in Nature, which I hope you're familiar with. And we actually devote quite a lot of time to writing about research life and lab life, including issues such as the one I described. And then, of course, there was the transition, for me, there was the transition to life of research publishing. Now, this came after a postdoc, so despite my original need to readjust as a PhD student, I actually went on to do a postdoc because I really was wanted to carry on my research itself. But in the end, I found frustrated by the need to focus my interests on the one project or a couple of projects that I was carrying out in the lab. I was just interested in too many things. There was never a doubt in my mind that I needed to stay closely linked to science, to research, but I decided that doing research myself was not for me. And today, when I give career talks, when I talk about these kinds of decision-making, probably the most important piece of advice that I can give to anyone is, if you are the person who gets out of bed in the morning because you know that that day you may be seeing something, discovering something, devising something for the first time that nobody on this planet in the whole history of humanity has ever seen, then don't leave original research. But if that's maybe not the key thing for you, but you're actually interested in the whole research enterprise, knowledge acquisition, amplification of knowledge, then there may be other very fruitful ways for you to contribute. And that was certainly the case for me. So very briefly, back in 2001, I left active research and I joined what was then Nature Publishing Group and now Springer Nature. I joined as associate editor at Nature Reviews Genetics. Back then the journal was only 6 months old. I then spent 6 years as its chief editor, and then I moved to Nature itself. I became the manuscript editor for genetics and genomics at Nature. I'll tell you a few things about that time, because in my whole sort of 20-year career as an editor, I have by now spent my longest time at Nature itself, but I also had other roles which I think were very instrumental. I later on became executive editor for Nature partner journals. Again, the driver for that was I wanted to expand my knowledge base. Nature partner journals was a portfolio of journals at the time we were launching, and they spanned a number of disciplines, including physics and chemistry. And it was really interesting for me to understand how research is done in those other disciplines and what kinds of challenges researchers in those disciplines have to face when they want to publish their research, when they want to surface their data, for example, et cetera, et cetera. Later on, I was editor-in-chief of Nature Communications, which was a particularly interesting time from perspective of open science and advancing and enabling researchers to share more and more about the data, about the materials, about the protocols, approaches, and so on. But about 3.5 years ago, an opportunity arose to put my hat into the ring for being editor-in-chief of Nature, and the rest is history, as they say. What I should say is that these transitions here, almost at every stage, certainly the transition from Nature Reviews Genetics to Nature as a manuscript editor, and then subsequently, most recently now, to being editor-in-chief. On each of these occasions, I would put in my application being completely convinced that, of course, I'm not going to be chosen to do the job, but I just have to have a go. So just a couple of comments about what kinds of experience I've had so far as an editor. And the reason why I want to share this with you, because I want to give you a sense what it is that editors do and how they contribute to the research ecosystem. And of course, that's my perspective. It's a personal perspective and a perspective of an insider. But I think you will find this interesting. So I was manuscript editor at Nature from 2008 to 2015. And that was a time, and I remind you, that's for genetics and genomics. And that was a time when genomics were really being harnessed. Genome sequencing was being harnessed for the first time in many different contexts. These days, almost in any sort of biomedical setting, there is some sequencing involved. Back then, it was just the early days. And so because of that focus, I had the opportunity to work with and contribute to a number of projects, including projects such as sequencing, originally genotyping, but then sequencing human samples to inform genetic basis of complex diseases so that we understand genetic susceptibility to disease. Sequencing sequencing of somatic genomes in cancer. So we learn more about initiators and drivers of initiation and progression in cancer, many different cancers, so we understand biology. Genome sequencing of individual species to inform evolution, including our own evolution. So for example, in that time, for the first time, genomes of our closest cousins, primates and great apes, were sequenced. Sequencing of genomes of crop plants so that we can better think about better crop engineering, and also indeed with the idea of feeding the world more effectively. And of course, understanding our own population structure, our own diversity, and very interestingly, understanding our own history of our own species. Of course, I'm thinking here about ancient genomics, genomes of Neanderthals and Denisovans, and how they have influenced our own presence. There were other opportunities as well. So one of those covers that I showed you there is that for the ENCODE project. It's over here in the bottom of the slide. And the ENCODE project was really the next step, if you like, from the sequencing of the genomes, and that was sort of the coding of how the information that is encoded in the genome, how it's interpreted and read out by the cells. I won't go into the details, but the reason why I'm focusing on it now is because the project was so vast. It included so much data and so much information that when we came to publish it, there were some 30 papers that were being published at the same time, not just in Nature, not just in the journals of Spring and Nature, but of other publishers. And we devised a really novel, networked way of cross-linking information across the papers. It was a fantastic collaboration with the authors, as well as my colleagues within Spring and Nature, but also outside of it. So it was a great collaboration across publishers. And then 3.5 years ago, I became editor-in-chief of Nature, and the timing could not have been better. It was just before we were coming to celebrate our 150th anniversary. What a fantastic opportunity to look back and reflect on the history of a journal which has been a reflection of really the scientific community and scientific output, and has been a prominent part of it. And so I want to share with you a couple of reflections which to me are really important. The first one is the expanding scope of Nature itself. It's important because Nature as a multidisciplinary journal needs to serve the widest possible research community. For a large part of its history, Nature was a multidisciplinary journal in the natural sciences, if you like. Today, I'm proud to say that we really are a multidisciplinary journal across research domains. What I'm showing you here on this slide is a sort of sampling of a few papers published in recent years, which we would have never considered 10 years ago. They just would not have been considered in scope for Nature, and yet they're so important and so impactful. And I'll come back to the issue of impact, or the point of impact, in a few minutes. It's also important, another reason why I'm sharing this with you is because if you remember, I already told you about my sort of eclectic broad interests, and that, for me, really tracks very well with my own perspective and my own desire to make as many connections, but also keep an open mind with respect to research. The other thing which has changed is what types of papers we publish in terms of format or what they report. Contrary to popular belief, we do publish replication studies. One example here is right at the top of the slide. This is a description of the so-called London patient. It's a replication study of the Berlin patient, so an individual who, as a result of hematopoietic stem cell transplant, because of a particular type of blood cancer that he had, was also cured of AIDS, of being HIV positive. And exactly the same procedure was repeated here on an individual in London. So an exact replication of the study. And just one other example to pick out here is this example here, regeneration of the entire human epidermis using transgenic stem cells. This was a patient, one young boy, so it was a case study. Again, 10 years, 15 years ago, we would have never published this in Nature. So this is an evolving process for us, and I think a very important direction for us to be traveling in. But of course, another thing which was really important to look at when looking back at our history was who is it that does science today as opposed to who was it that did science when we were first launched back in 1869. And very clearly, almost a cartoon-like slide, and yet it really does illustrate the point. Back at the end of 19th century, those who did science represented a very particular demographic in every possible sense of the word. Very fortunately, today, the situation is different, and it continues to move. And may we move in the right direction even faster than we're moving now. But this was a really important realization for us, which made us even more convinced that we need to do all we can to accelerate that transition towards science being done by an increasingly diverse group of actors. One of the things that we looked at back in 2019 was indeed how authorship by women in our pages has changed. This was something we published in our anniversary issue, just looking at a snapshot. You can see, for us, very satisfyingly, the number of women authors rising. In 2019, that came up to 30%, which is commonly considered to be the proportion of women in active research today. Again, needless to say, I would like this to continue to rise. Our commissioning editors, those who commission, for example, reviews or opinion content, pay very close attention to who they commission, not just from the perspective of are they well-placed to comment on a particular topic, but do they represent a more diverse or rather less well represented group, so their opinion may be appropriately fresh and balance with all the other opinions that we've already published, or indeed that others have published. When we talk about women researchers, and of course from our perspective, in particular when we talk about women authors, we have to consider the context in which these women do their work, originally the research and then the publication. And of course the recent context that we've all been talking about and paying attention to is the pandemic itself. There is much has been written about how research itself has been affected by the pandemic, how the publication dynamic has changed. This is just one example based on one study that looked at publications in Elsevier journals, actually, looking at effectively splitting publications by women and men as authors, also splitting by career stage and by, broadly speaking, by discipline. I find it significant that the biggest difference is in health and medicine at the time when the pandemic is going on. I'm not going to draw the full conclusion because I don't have enough data to draw the full conclusion, but to me the observation is really interesting. There's quite a strong difference also in social sciences and economics. We need to do more work and collect more data to understand why this is happening. Many have written about, for example, and I'm showing you some examples here, that of course during the pandemic, women unfortunately found themselves with much greater pressure to look after the families and look after the home. Undoubtedly, that unfortunately continues to be the case, but it cannot account for the subject area difference that you see on that plot. One other thing I want to draw your attention to on this slide is how much space we actually devote to these issues in the pages of Nature. These are really important issues. What it is that, why is it that women find it more difficult to, maybe not these days so much enter the research as a career, but continue along this path, especially to positions, the really prominent positions and positions of leadership. We continue to write about ongoing issues such as, for example, continued unbalanced pay when you compare men and women across actually sectors, but of course our focus is mainly on research itself. And of course we write about not just about the importance of balanced gender balance in those who do science, but also the topics and the questions that are asked within the sciences themselves. So one other thing, actually quite a recent thing, and maybe you've seen it, that I wanted to touch on is this issue of impact. What is impact? When I, as editor-in-chief of Nature, when I talk about impact, I'm sure most of you immediately make a jump to thinking about impact factor. That's actually not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about impact of work that is published, that is communicated in our pages or in pages of any other journals. And here's a very interesting, piece that was just published a couple of weeks ago on the LSE blog. A couple of researchers who explored this question, which is actually well established, that work published by women researchers is less cited than that published by male researchers. And there, in fact, have been some studies where the same work was published with changed names, and the same work receives fewer citations. And here's an interesting suggestion that the authors come up with, and that is that, in fact, the work published by female researchers is read more, but is less cited because the topics are more relevant to societal progress as opposed to academic progress. And so this is what I mean by impact. When we talk about citations to individual papers, or when we then feed citations into an impact factor, which of course is only a measure of a journal, we're talking about impact within academia, but there is so much more impact that research can and should have, and that cannot be measured appropriately by citations. And that's another reason for which I'm so happy that we at Nature are continuing on this journey to expand our scope, because those other papers, some examples I showed you earlier, are unlikely to garner a lot of citations, but they are more likely to make a real difference to policymakers and for example, and by extension, to people on the ground. In the interest of time, I'm going to speed up a little, but I will tell you, again, remind you that one of the ways in which we try to support women in research is by shining a light on outstanding women in research, researchers themselves. There are very few awards that do this. There is a very prominent award that L'Oreal support for established women in science. This award is specifically for early career researchers, women early career researchers. I've been involved with this award from the very start for 4 years, and I can tell you it's an incredibly humbling experience. Every year we have not only a tough time choosing a winner, but every year I ask myself, what exactly have I done with my life as compared to the incredible applications that we receive. And of course, there are additional ways in which we can support diversity amongst researchers. One of them, for example, we organize events, nature conferences. For example, 2 years ago, we came out with a new code of conduct or a policy for our events, where we actually specifically said that we will strive towards gender parity in main sort of keynote speakers, but most emphatically, we will not have male-only panels. I also sort of publicly pledged on Twitter that I will not moderate male-only panels. And I have to say, I've had surprising success in pushing at organizers who asked me to moderate panels, and I would actually push them to increase diversity of those panels, be it gender diversity or other aspects of diversity. So the reason why I'm sharing this with you is to encourage you to do the same. If none of us tolerate certain lack of diversity, it will not persist. We will make a difference. And couple of other comments to this. Of course, one aspect of diversity is seniority. All too often, very senior, established researchers get all the glory and find themselves under the spotlight. But of course, early career researchers have tremendous amount to contribute that is actually completely complementary and sometimes orthogonal to what established researchers have to contribute. So we have been working with early career researchers, trying to train them in many ways is one example that Nature Communications and the Nature Reviews journals do, working with early career researchers to train them for better, more effective peer review. And in this process, we actually pair up individual editors with early career researchers. And finally, one example of a workshop, which was a bespoke workshop for which we partnered with this organization called Afrocentric to deliver some training workshops to researchers, early career researchers in Africa. So a couple of other points. I already talked to you about who does science. It's also important where science is done. To show the diversity of settings in which science or research is done, we started this format at Nature, Where I Work. It's a very simple format. It's really focused on images mainly, showing a researcher in the natural habitat, if you like, where they actually do the work. It's accompanied with a very short journalistic write-up of the work of the main focus. But a picture really does speak 1,000 words. It shows you not only who does science, the great diversity of researchers themselves, but it shows you that diversity of settings. I think it's very powerful. It's actually more powerful than I think we realized when we launched the particular section. But it's not a complete picture either, because of course all of you know that in reality, science is a team sport. Individuals don't do science. I mean, they do, of course, individuals work towards it, but in the end, it happens as part of teams. And again, just like earlier I was talking about mentorship, team science collaborations is something which is not sufficiently well recognized. And just to illustrate to you how important collaborations are and how collaborations can address questions that cannot be addressed otherwise, let me give you an example which has nothing to do with science. You may or may not remember Panama Papers from a few years ago. This was effectively a scandal that was exposed by a consortium of journalists. And this was, of course, that hidden infrastructure of offshore tax havens that was exposed by them, this international consortium of investigative journalists. Now, journalists usually work alone. That's, par excellence profession where individuals work alone. And yet this group, no single journalist, because of the scale of the issue and the amount of money involved in the issue, no single journalist could have cracked this particular problem. It was that consortium, it was the collaboration, the free exchange of information that led to what we now know as Panama Papers. So there are some questions for which we need to come together. And we know that collaborations are on the rise. Indeed, some of the most burning questions that researchers apply themselves to are so complex and global that they require collaborative approaches. And now there is original research suggesting that as new teams come together, those teams come up with fresh ideas and new approaches, perhaps intuitively not surprising, but it's actually now been formally investigated. And of course, again, signaling that we all understand the pandemic has affected collaborations just as it has affected other aspects of our lives. Collaborations are not easy, although when done well, they improve research culture. We talk about it so much. In a collaborative setting, you have less room for acute competition, which of course detrimentally contributes to research culture. We try and help by publishing stories of examples where collaboration has really worked and helped to advance an issue, but also by interviewing and integrating feedback from all of you, researchers themselves, publishing tips on how to collaborate well. And it's in itself, it's a collaborative process on the journal, but also with the research community. The collaboration does not end within the research community itself. Increasingly, across different disciplines, it extends further. It extends beyond those who are formally trained as researchers, and more of us are talking about co-production of research. So think of patients being involved in designing clinical trials, for example, for drugs or into other medical interventions that may affect them directly, their condition. There's just one example. And collaboration, of course, extends to us. This is the Nature team. I'm just one person standing in front of you, but of course, all these colleagues are the people who contribute to the original research that's published almost on a daily basis, certainly to the news that are published, and other types of expert comments and podcasts and videos that you see from Nature as well. All of that happens as a result of collaboration, internal collaboration, but also collaboration with you. And all of those people I showed you on the slide a second ago decided to choose this alternative career, the alternative career that I decided to choose as well. There are a number of ways in which individuals who are trained within the research, within the sciences, can continue to contribute to the research ecosystem. And these contributions are very important. And of course, research does not just happen in academia. Much of it happens in industry or in the private sector, and perhaps increasingly so. That's something that all of us, I think, have to embrace and learn to live with in a sort of equitable, collaborative way again. When I left the lab, leaving the lab was considered to be a failure. But what I would like to suggest to you that what is a failure and what is success is really relative. It's how you feel about being able to bring a contribution. And from different vantage point, from different perspective, that contribution can come and be really valuable depending on the person, depending on the circumstances. And I would say ought to be valued equally. Researchers who are no longer doing research per se have an enormous amount to contribute. You may have seen a recent comment from Dame Kate Bingham about the fact that we are suffering in this country because of the lack of scientific expertise and knowledge in the government. And yet, there is a certain reluctance within academia towards early career researchers leaving to pursue other careers. What I would like to suggest is that we need to be more supportive and appreciative of the different contributions that individuals can make. And just look at this. This is a picture of leadership in research of individuals who no longer engage in active research. You have chief scientists of WHO on this slide. You have chief scientists of FAO, president of the National Academy of Sciences, executive of the Royal Society, head of UKRI, head of African Institute of Mathematical Sciences, director of British Antarctic Survey, and chief scientist of Australia. I couldn't fit any more on the slide, but I could have fitted some more. Each of these individuals was a researcher at some point, and now makes an incredibly important contribution to the future of research in this other capacity. So I hope I have taken you on a journey through bold decisions, failures, but also some passions and sort of eclectic interests. I want to thank you for your attention and thank you for the opportunity, this incredible opportunity, to share with you a little bit about me and a little bit about how we at Nature are trying to contribute to, I think, a much better future of the research ecosystem. Thank you very much.
Magdalena, thank you very much for that inspiring and thought-provoking talk. I loved your road to Cambridge and beyond, and the ability to think about not only what science is and how we measure what it is, but also what it's about, impact as well as discovery. Who does science? What a fantastic range of people you introduced us to there. The nature of teams, collaborations, how they're recognized, and of course the many facets of leadership, of which you yourself are a very important example. So thank you for agreeing to take some questions as well from our both in-person audience and our online audience. Mary mentioned, I think, at the beginning that if you have joined the event virtually, please make sure your questions in the Q&A function online, and then Charlie here from the events team is going to raise a physical hand to signal there's a question from the virtual audience. So I will alternate between those online and those in person in terms of questions. So those of you here in person, also raise your hand if you have a question, and then we can direct those to Magdalena. So thank you. Who would like to start? Okay, let's start here.
You talked about alternative careers. I'd be interested to know what you see as the main barriers to pursuing alternative careers. Do they come from within, from your own preconceptions, from society, or maybe from potential recruiters or employers in alternative careers? Just be interested to hear.
I think that's a very important question. The first comment I would make in response to your question is really a plea. I think it would be quite nice not to call them alternative careers, because by virtue of calling them that, they somehow become other. We all know that as we embark on our journey from undergraduate through graduate, even postdoc and so on, the numbers will dwindle, if you like, in that academic research pursuit. And that's hard to imagine how that could even change, even if we wanted to change the absolute numbers. There are many careers, and as I was trying to illustrate, the really valuable alternatives right across the spectrum for how research experience can be harnessed to a really important end. So the first step, I would say, is let's not call them alternative careers. It's an array of possible careers that can be pursued. And from that, I would say, the next step is, deep down, we all want to be accepted by our peers. If we have a sense that what we're choosing is in some way less well valued or less well perceived, then maybe only some of us have the stamina, the courage, the audacity, the naivety, whatever you like to call it, to carry on that road. So I think all of us should support those choices through mentorship, through discussion, because as I say, we do need trained scientists with research experience in many different walks of life. We of course need them to do research as well, very clearly, but in many other walks of life as well.
Okay, Charlie, first online question.
Yeah, great. Thank you for your lecture. That's provoked a load of questions online across various different topics. So I think if we start with a question around planning your career, and Harmony would like to know, what is your key criterion in making a career choice? Do you choose the option you like the most among the options that are feasible, or do you know exactly what you want and then create the capability to follow?
Very good question. If I take the question literally and the question is directed to me, how do I make my choices? Throughout my life, I've made choices guided by what I was interested in. So it really was a question of, what is it that's going to occupy me? It's almost a selfish way of making a decision, but I wanted to have a good time. I wanted to be interested and engaged in what I was doing. And sometimes that meant that the decisions I was making were not necessarily, certainly did not appear to others as being, let's say, a career-driven choice. I mean, one example was when I moved from Nature to being executive editor of the Nature Partner journals. In fact, many colleagues said to me, why? Why are you doing this? You have this amazing role at Nature. And I knew that I wanted, of course it was an amazing role, but I wanted to extend my understanding and my appreciation of other topics, and that was a great opportunity to do so. So for me, it was my own interest, because I knew that as long as I do something that I'm genuinely passionate about and interested in, I'll be happy. And that's a really important thing for me in life.
Now, I see, I'd like to turn to this part of the room, because I haven't seen any hands up yet. Madam at the back there, thank you. Can we get the microphone over there? Sorry,
it's coming.
I should have said the boom microphone is moving around, so we'll take a little time to move between questions.
Thank you so much. Hi. Thank you so much for this talk. Could you please speak a little bit more about, the competitive nature of academia, right? The whole publish or perish sort of unspoken rule, and how, prestigious journals such as Nature, Science or Cell, are kind of dealing with that very, very competitive edge in academia and research that can maybe drive some researchers out of that field. Thanks.
I think you raise a really important issue. There is a lot of competition in science. Some competition is a good thing, but the extreme focus on competition is definitely not a good thing. It has an impact on individuals' mental health, has an impact on research culture, which I mentioned at some point, which is increasingly a focus of discussion. But because there are more and more discussions of this topic, I'm actually very optimistic that we're beginning to embrace a much more holistic evaluation of what it means to contribute to research or research community. So publications are only one type of contribution. I'll give you an example. So as you just heard, I grew up, if you like, in the genetics and genomics community. Genomics is one of those examples where those who generate data perform a really important function for the community. And of course, there are many other disciplines where this is also true. And that community, the genomics community, has been talking about valuing data generators on par with authors of papers for a very long time. We're still talking about it. We're still not quite there. But for example, one way in which we have tried at Nature and in Nature Portfolio, we have tried to help this conversation along is quite some time ago, actually more than 10 years ago, we've devised a very granular author contribution statement. Because on a paper where you have 300, 400, or 1,000 authors, if you're the person in the middle, unless of course you're a particle physicist, in which case where you are in the paper is going to be determined by your surname, because they use alphabet. But in most other fields is determined in some other way. So if you're a middle author on the paper, who knows what you've contributed to the paper? If you have a really granular author contribution statement, you know that you may be in the middle, but your contribution to generating data was absolutely crucial, and this study would never have happened without you. And not only the generation, but maybe curation as well, because that means that these data can be reused and give rise to subsequent analyses and subsequent papers, or maybe not even papers, right? Who knows? Or specific inventions or discoveries. Mentorship, I talked about before. The degree of collaborations, peer reviewing, all of these things are things which researchers contribute to as part of their membership of the research community. There is a shift towards valuing all these aspects of research life. We're not quite there yet, but I am optimistic. I'm generally an optimistic person. I am optimistic that we will come to a much more balanced view, which I think will temper that sort of focus on competition that you talk about. But I think that's very important. We cannot take our eye off that.
Thank you. I'll come to one more online, but just to note, I see a row here of enthusiastic, aspiring scientists. So I would love to encourage you to think about how your questions would be becoming. Oh, good. There's one there. Go ahead, please.
Okay. I was wondering, why do you believe there is such a strong fear of failure and of making the wrong decision in career choice among younger researchers?
I think there is a fear of failure in general. I mean, nobody likes to fail, right? And in certain, especially when it comes to your career path, what I'm about to say, I don't think is particular necessarily to research itself in general, in sort of career progression. In certain circles, there is a tendency to sort of, let me just sort of put it this way, to storify one's life as if everything was planned. And that's one of the things that I try to share with you very clearly. You know, I am able to sort of tell you my life story in a way as if I planned everything, but don't believe it for a moment, right? Things just fell into place and I had to sort of move forward and back a little and so on. So if you find yourself in a situation, in a circle where everybody else around you appears to have had a perfect life of success and continuous progression towards some early adopted goal, against that background, it's really hard to say, actually, things are not working very well, or I've been trying to achieve this or that, and I have to take a step back, and I'm keep being knocked back. So it depends on the circumstances, but I think it's a human condition, if you like, aspect of human condition. We all prefer to succeed than to fail, and then so because we also know that failure is part of life, I think all of us have to be more tolerant of failure. We all fail at some point, so when others around us fail, we have to be more tolerant of it.
Thank you. Let's turn to one online question next and then come back to the live audience.
Great. So we've had quite a few questions come in around mentorship, including one from a PhD student who's asking, what qualities do you look for when searching for a good mentor? And do you think as a woman, you think that you should search for female mentors?
Very good question. Just at the outset, I would say I don't have a recipe. I can tell you what I think is really important in a good mentor. A quality which is really important in general, but not necessarily very common. I think a good mentor has to listen really well. So sometimes people ask, what's your mentoring style, or what's the best mentoring style? I think the best mentoring style is the one which is suited to the mentee. But in order to find that style, by definition, you have to listen to what it is that the mentee needs or wants from you. Now, to the second part of the question, I think it really depends. It depends what the mentee is looking for. I mentioned one mentor who is a man. I've been influenced and inspired by many women. I can't think of one specific female mentor that I've had, but for me, that wasn't an issue. I think it depends what kind of advice, what kind of support is required. Now, having said that, I very strongly feel that role models are required. So we need women role models. We need role models that are diverse. We cannot have all role models or all mentors who all look the same. So I think that is very important. But whether for a woman mentee, a woman mentor is required, I think that really depends on the mentee herself.
Thank you. There's a question here.
Hi. Thank you for the incredible talk. It was very inspiring. I wanted to know a bit more about if you faced any obstacles or failures during your career path in nature, and how did you deal with them?
Did you ask specifically at Nature?
Yeah, your editorial career.
Yeah, sure. Nothing is complete plain sailing. There have been jobs I applied for which I really didn't get, as opposed to the ones I thought I wouldn't get, but I did get. But maybe that's an aspect of my own personality. I think I've already mentioned a couple of times that I'm an optimistic person, so my glass is always half full. So the jobs that I didn't get, I tended to spend time reflecting on why it was that I didn't get it. I mean, there was one job in particular that I really wanted, and I was so convinced that I was the right candidate for it, that when I didn't get it, I was completely gutted. I was not prepared for not getting that job, because I thought, well, it's obvious, no other candidate, I am the one. And it's quite interesting, because obviously I didn't get the jobs I didn't think I would get. So for me, from perspective of time, I sort of reflected, okay, so how do I project my abilities, my contribution that I'm proposing to bring to the role in a situation where I feel overconfident about the result, as opposed to in a situation where I really need to work a bit harder. And maybe that's my personal thing. Think back to what I told you about genetics. I wasn't very good at genetics. I didn't get it to begin with, and I fell in love with it. And it's been a theme throughout my life. Of course, today I care about many different disciplines, but my first love is still genetics. So maybe that's an aspect of my personality. But the most important thing, and it's almost a cliche, but it really is true in my case, the most important thing is trying to learn a lot from failures. And in retrospect, when I think about these situations where I didn't succeed, I actually now think it's better that I didn't, because new opportunities arose, or I created or helped to create new opportunities, and other things happened.
Might I quickly ask what the job was that you really wanted to get?
Ask me afterwards. It's off the record.
That's the that's the unfair question. Yeah. Good. Thank you. Are there any more questions from our virtual audience there, Charlie?
Yeah, we've still got plenty, but a lot of people have been asking for some advice. I think a lot of early career people have been thinking about that. And so someone has asked, what are the top 3 traits an early career researcher should hone in order to have a successful career? That's quite an important question.
Wow. You're saving all the easy questions for the end, right? Top 3 traits. Very difficult. And of course, it depends on how you define a successful career. If you define it the way I've defined it earlier, and that is I need to do something that I'm really interested in, because that's what's going to make me happy, that's really what's going to get me out of bed, then I would say, the first most important trait or quality is be true to yourself. The other things I already said, I think learning from failure is incredibly important. But that requires a degree of honesty with self to be able to do that. And the other thing, which sounds obvious, but not everybody knows how to do it, is take advice from others. Sometimes it's more difficult to truly open up to take advice from others. It sounds like an obvious thing to say, but it can be more difficult. So that's just 3 things off the top of my head, but that's a tough question.
Good. Let me see if there's one more question from the room. Yes. Now, let's see. Can we get the... It's a long way, so if you speak up, and then we'll see if we need...
Yes. I think what I absolutely love from your perspective is seeing alternatives as alternatives. But I think for young careers, it's very difficult to see it because they grew up in this academic pathway. And everything they see is just that academic pathway. And they are certainly good at some part of what they're doing, but there is a certain skill set which is required to actually achieve and then become professor or a good professor or whatever. So I think it's very important for us also as an academic kind of society to show that there are alternatives and that it's very good if they go that way, and that this little small pathway is actually only for a certain type of personalities or for a certain type of combined skill set, and not for everyone. So I think that's what we all need to kind of make people aware of, because I think that's not what it is. We all see only this one professor we want to become, but it might not be that you are actually quite suited for that role, as you rightly say. But I think it needs to be communicated, it needs to be kind of shown to our young researchers or even to the students already who come and go that way, that there are a multitude of other jobs available who all need what they learn in our institution as a student and then go on.
Couldn't agree more. And especially the thing you said at the end, all these other employers, institutions, settings and circumstances, they all need the skills that those early career researchers or early career professionals acquire in this sort of academic learned setting. So surfacing that, exactly as you said, emphasizing that, but also actually almost giving the confidence to the students or very early career researchers that they already have that skill set. I actually remember when I first began to think, remember I told you about these dreams I had of like unfolding the whole research career before me when I was sitting back in Cambridge. Oh yes, I know I'm going to, figure out the whole, comparative evolutionary process of sex determination. But afterwards, I remember thinking, well, actually, maybe that's not going to happen. So what else is going to happen? What else can I do? I've only ever been in that academic setting, right? pipetting or looking down the microscope or whatever it is, that, whatever else I did, is of limited direct value beyond the lab setting. But actually, there's so many other skills that we all acquire as part of that research setting, and showing them in that other, broader context, I think is really important. It's part of mentorship, it's part of education. I think the system is much better at doing it today than it was when I was doing research, and certainly better than it was even before that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you all very much. I think that seems that optimistic, half full, as you say, way of looking at the future, I think is a good place for us to perhaps end this lecture. And so I'd like to close with just some thanks to the various people who've taken part. First, let me start by noting that this is the 20th anniversary of the founding of the Athena Swan Lecture at Imperial. And it has been and continues to be an important element of our equality, diversity, and inclusion activities. A lot of that work is led and supported by the EDIC Center. So I'd like to thank all of the members of that center, as well as all of the groups from the college that support and inform and advise and help us with that strategy, to express my thanks to them for that work. Second, the organization per se of this lecture is not a negligible amount of work, so let me thank the teams who have put together today and worked to help us navigate the hybrid environment in which we now find ourselves. I noticed that I used the word live audience, and I realized that in a hybrid word that's quite divisive. I didn't mean that, so I apologize. It's those of you in person and those of you online. And thank you for those in person, and thank you to those online for your participation and questions today. And finally, Magdalena, thank you very much for your talk and the questions and the answers that you gave. It has been really very inspiring to hear of your journey, and thank you for emphasizing not only successes, but also things which didn't quite go as you planned, but led to new avenues for thinking about growth. And some of the themes that you mentioned that I found particularly resonant, the idea of learning from all of those around you, mentors, reverse mentors, I suppose obverse mentors, those who we think of conventionally as having experience which is valuable, but those also who have new perspectives that might open our eyes to new things. And I think in our research, all of us understand that students help us bring that important perspective to our research. And it's nice to hear that we can learn things about how to steer our own careers from them too. And the idea of both determinism and serendipity, which again is something in science, but in life, and how you navigated the course of your own career through opportunities and decisions that had to follow from those, I think was really helpful. And then again, the notion of how leadership in science and the very many aspects of science, from the undertaking of the experiments themselves to how it is disseminated to how it delivers impact, and the many roles of leadership that go into that. All of those were really important, and thank you very much for raising them. So, thank you again,
thank you,
Magdalena, for joining us and for your insights and talk today.
Thank you, it's a real pleasure.
Thank you.